Hello, I'm Christopher Ullman, and I'm going to work with you about your worldview. And I'd like to start out by having a look at the first slide and let you know that I'm interested in seeing you actually write down your worldview. And it's your worldview. That's why that's in capital letters. It's not somebody else's. It doesn't involve any research on your part. It simply involves reflection, thinking about what it is that you believe to be true, and then writing it down. So let's talk about worldview. What does it mean? And it starts out by being a set of things that we presuppose to be true, things that we perhaps have never questioned before. And we've asked some big questions of ourselves, and the way we put together those answers constitutes our worldview. As you can tell, the worldview is probably in a condition of being revised from time to time by important events that take place. It also can be seen as something like a set of spectacles or glasses through which we view the events of life. And everybody who uses glasses of any kind, even if it's just sunglasses, knows that it brings into resolution that which otherwise isn't very clear. I use reading glasses. Besides that, I can see just fine, but the reading glasses help to bring into focus what otherwise wouldn't be as clear. And that's the way a worldview works. You can also see it as being something like kind of a dictionary or a lexicon for experience. So, you hit the brakes quickly and you find that you've just avoided a major car accident. And how do you understand what just took place? And it's kind of almost maybe a near death experience, but you'll find some way of trying to interpret what just happened. The physical occurrence needs to be cataloged in your brain so you can remember it, so that you can hopefully benefit from it. And that's where the worldview comes in. It gives you terms and ways to think about what's just happened. Some ways of understanding the worldview would be some metaphors. One of them is the camera filter, and how you can put different filters on a camera to accentuate certain light waves, certain features. It also can be the way you use the lens on a camera, how you can zoom in or you can draw back and get a big panoramic view of things. Worldviews allow us to have that sort of power over our perceptions and our experiences. Um, in library science, there's definitely something called a controlled vocabulary, and you have to encounter that when you do your searching for resources using the internet. What is something typically called? And that's imposed on those websites by librarians and by other catalogers. A worldview helps you to catalog what's taken place so you can come back and actually find it again. A building framework is another way of looking at a worldview. When construction takes place, typically there are great plans that have been made by architects, the gathering of lots of funds so that there would be a big stacks of building supplies ready to be constructed. And of course, the foundation has to be built. On that foundation, girders are erected so that you can create floors upon which you can put items and windows and walls and doors and furnishings and eventually people. Well, a worldview functions like a building framework. It gives you places to put things in your understanding. You have to believe something before you can know anything. And our construction of a worldview in our lives begins even before we've learned language. We discover as little babies that if we rattle the rattle, somebody might come running. Certainly, if we cry out, mom or dad will show up. We discover that we can make noise with our hands as we play with that mobile right hanging above us. And one of the most amazing things about children is when they first discover their own hands and they realize, oh, that's what's been making that noise. So you see, you learn and believe things before you begin to gather knowledge about those things. There was a mathematician named Gödel, and he said that there is no internally consistent system. I'm not so sure about that, but I'm kind of intrigued by the idea. Even mathematics, which seems to be a universal language, requires kind of an understanding of the discreteness of different items. So, for example, right now there was a little tiny spider crawling across the wall here in my office, and I recognized it as something that I don't want it to continue to live. But why was that? I have to look outside the system to figure out why that little tiny spider probably it's not going to survive outside in the cold, and I don't want him surviving here in the house. So I took the option of letting of making sure that he ended. And so, why did I do that? I can't justify that from within the system. I have to bring something else from the outside. It's the same thing even with numbers. What is one? How do we understand what two is? That sounds pretty heady, doesn't it? Pretty intellectual. But Gödel's point was that you still have to import something in from outside, even a mathematical system, in order to make it make sense. So for us to be able to add 2 plus 3, and what does that equal? Well, let's see, I'm thinking 2 plus 3 equals 5. But that's only if 2 is always 2 and 3 is always 3. And I don't know how I can justify that with just the numbers. Maybe 2 sometimes increases, maybe it decreases. You see, I've had to import the constancy of a number into mathematics in order for mathematics to make sense. But mathematics can't provide that for me. I have to believe it before I can use numbers or anything else. And this is something that children are constantly filling in their understanding because they ask the question, why? The why exercise to reinforce learning. Boy, they just continually ask those questions. And of course, the sequence of why mommy, why is the sky blue? And eventually, mommy or daddy, whoever is being asked, is going to say that's just because. That's the way it is. And then if the child asks one more why question, usually they're going to be referred to the other parent. Just go ask your dad. And you see, eventually we get to the point where we've hit the bedrock. And that's what a child's trying to do. They want to get down to the basis of things. Why are these things that way? Why do we call that this? So why bother with the worldview? Facts need something in which to live. They don't just float around free form. They're not just out there in the sky. They're embedded in experiences and concrete things. And how do we understand those experiences and concrete things? We need a worldview. A great philosopher named Augustine said, you have to believe something before you can know anything. I think that's pretty interesting to consider. You see, a person in the possession of a fact, he already has a worldview that makes that fact relevant to him. What is today? Well, today is Thursday. Well, how is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because I operate on a 7-day calendar. And this is the, 5th day of the week. And tomorrow will be Friday, and the day after that will be Saturday. And I've got to get some things done today because my students are counting on me. Well, that all presupposes that calendars make sense and that they're important. And there's not 9 days to a week. There's not only 3 days to a week. Lots of things there that the worldview helps me to make sense of the observation, a very basic observation that today is Thursday. And if I don't have that worldview, the fact won't be relevant to me. So why bother if we have facts to have a worldview? Well, let's take a look at facts. A couple examples. Bernard Nathanson was the presiding physician in the nation's largest abortion clinic many years ago in New York City. He himself had performed many abortions. And he used ultrasound to help make sure that the abortion procedure was complete. If he didn't, there would be really bad consequences. So he used ultrasound, and then one day it dawned on him as he looked at the ultrasound, that's a patient. And that observation changed the way he looked at the entire procedure. And he became very staunchly, very adamantly a pro-life person after being a very active pro-choice person. Another example about how things can change based on your worldview is the way that bloodhounds operate. You know, they have a sense of smell that's about 1,000,000 times better than ours, and that's no exaggeration. In other words, it only takes one particle for them to smell what it might take 1,000,000 for us to actually register. So you would think that the bloodhound is probably kind of blowing his mind all the time, since, my goodness, he's being avalanched and bombarded with all these different smells and odors and scents. But you see, the bloodhound has to have it made important to him. When a person is being tracked, typically, think about it. How do they get the bloodhound to actually do the job of tracking that person? Well, you have to make that person's scent important to the bloodhound. And the trainers know how to take a garment of clothing and make it, smelled by the bloodhound, and then the blood off the bloodhound goes running to track that person down. Prior to that, all that sense perception that he was getting wasn't significant, but all of a sudden it became important to him to track down that one scent, and he becomes very good at it and very effective at it. And that's how worldviews can work. They make certain things significant. We recognize that the way we see things can be influenced by what we assume. I call that a paradigm. The paradigm is a set of things that we believe to be true. Without a paradigm, facts cannot be brought into focus or into harmony. So as we look at the picture on the screen, we see what appears to be a beautiful young lady with a feather in the front of a scarf that she's wearing, and she's looking off to her, I guess it would be she's looking to the left, and there's her ear, and there's the line of her jaw, and there's a little necklace or a necklace around her neck, and she's wearing a kind of a black coat of some kind or garment. And then all of a sudden we recognize that may not be what I thought it was. And I look at it a second time and I see an old lady. I see an old lady, and I see that what was the jawbone line is actually a line that depicts where her nose is. And I can see her eye there, right beneath the black hair coming down. And then I see that she's also wearing a big scarf, and she has that grim look on her face, on her mouth, which looked like it was the necklace. You see, once you get a view of this, the isolated bits of data we see, we need something to organize them, to make them usable. The new paradigm forever shapes our perception of the facts. In fact, you can't unsee the old lady now that you've seen her. And maybe you haven't seen her yet, but you will. If you look at this long enough, you'll see both the young lady and the old lady. A man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. Well, let's think about that. That sounds convincing. But I have to ask myself some questions. First of all, what do I mean by experience? I'm going to have to define it, aren't I? And what did you experience that event as? What we experience something as, those two little letters are pretty important, helps us to see what just took place. An example can be what takes place when at night I'm traveling in a new area and there's fog, and all of a sudden the vehicle in which I am takes a downward turn, and I realize I'm moving quickly downward on a hill that I didn't know was there. Now, the experience of falling in that automobile or in that vehicle is visceral, it's physical, but the way I experience is probably associated with an emotion. At that point, it would at least be alarm or maybe even panic, especially if I don't know how long and deep that hill is. Take the same kind of visceral experience of being on a roller coaster. And as you get to the top of the roller coaster, you're going to have that sinking feeling once again. But you have a different way of experiencing that because, hey, your eyes are open. You kind of did this on purpose. You sort of want to have fun falling in that circumstance. And instead of outright panic or alarm, it's exhilaration. Interesting how the same physical experience is interpreted by our presuppositions a little bit differently in both examples. You see, experience that doesn't have some support of explanation, it doesn't have any meaning. And it's easy to see how animals don't experience things the way that we do. To put a cat in front of a mirror and see how long the cat actually is interested in what it sees. Put a human in front of a mirror and you might not be able to pull them away from it. Experience has transmission problems. That's another issue with experience. I can't transmit my experience directly into anybody else. I have to describe it. In order to describe it, I'll need a worldview. Now, here's some questions that help to put together a worldview, and I've only chosen a few of them. Obviously, there are some that are very important that we aren't putting on this list, but let's start with these. What is really real? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is human nature? What happens to a person after death? How do you determine right and wrong? Why is it possible to know anything at all? And what's the meaning of history? We'll come back to those in just a minute, but let's figure out why a person's worldview changes. Some of the ways it changes, and when changes take place in a person's life, are a crisis. I think the COVID crisis has brought about some changes in people's worldviews. Can you think of some other examples, other kinds of things that we go through that result in a changed worldview? I know I lost my job in June, my full-time job. It made me kind of consider and wonder just about a few things. Relationship changes can make a difference. Death, illness, moving, lots of different things. A crisis in the nation can certainly bring about a worldview change for some people. What happens is there's doubts that the crisis may bring up, and we kind of push them aside and forget about them. And you know what happens if you forget about a splinter? If you don't take it out, if you don't deal with it, it's going to get infected. It's called festering, and it's not good. There's an inflammation, there's problems, and eventually now the problem becomes bigger than what it was at the beginning. Sometimes a person's worldview changes because they take the time to just sit down and think, kind of evaluate what they've been doing. It's called reflection. It's a very important thing in philosophy to reflect. And all of a sudden, a light bulb goes off, or goes on, I should say, and things light up that weren't previously very well illuminated. How a worldview makes a difference? Well, on 9/11, 2001, a handful of men flew jets into American buildings. And the big question for many people was why? And we recognize that plan to fly jets into American buildings made good sense to the people who trained to do it. I think there were 19 total people that were running those planes into those buildings and blowing them up. And I suppose one of the beliefs that each one of them had was that all supporters of Israel are legitimate targets. And secondly, we're at war with America. And third, maybe only an Islamic fundamentalist government is acceptable. And fourthly, we will be in paradise after this noble act. If I believed all four of those things, it might have made more sense to me to be involved in the 9/11 events. You see, if there's no worldview, there's no basis for significant actions. But with a worldview, people become motivated. They're willing to make sacrifices. They're willing to plan. They're willing to delay gratification to get more important things done. I suppose you need to ask some questions about your own education. Why are you doing this? And what makes sense to you now is based upon the worldview that you have. And hopefully you'll get some real benefit from your education. That's my goal as an instructor, is to help you benefit. Um, if there's no worldview, there's really no way to talk about things. It's difficult. It's interesting that a worldview is required in order for us to have words that actually make sense to us or to anybody else. And if there's no worldview, it's pretty hard to have discrete thoughts about things other than just immediate perceptions. Not much human thinking can take place without a worldview to make sense of the thought. So, a worldview gives us focus. It can show us the big view, the macroscopic, so to speak, the big broad landscape, maybe the whole tapestry hanging on the wall. And maybe the view from the mountaintop is another way of looking at this, how a worldview puts things in perspective in that way. However, from a distance, the panoramic view lacks definition. And so we need to also be able to zoom in to see things closely. And a worldview then becomes a microscopic view of a little tiny detail in the midst of the context of the big picture. Another way of looking at how the worldview gives us significant understanding is to show us what is the role of the different threads in the tapestry. Maybe how do I zoom in and view from the valley a single item on the ground that I saw from the mountaintop only dimly. But now I get down in the valley and stoop down and take a close look and recognize what that item really is down on the ground, that single item. It's a detailed vision of one or of a few things. And we can only manage just so much detail at a given time. So the worldview helps us to determine what's most important right now. However, it lacks perspective without the panorama view. We need them both, the zoom and the panorama view, and a worldview functions to give us both of those. You see, we're going to have to be kind of get it into the abstract a little bit. And to apply a truth, we must climb the stairs. Something happened to them way back then, or to that. And now, how does it make sense to me and in dealing with this particular item? So we start from that experience way back when, and maybe it's in history or maybe it's in our own personal history. And I recognize I'm going to need some ways of understanding that one little bit, that one piece of datum. And it's what it's going to take to make something important about that specific and particular thing is a more general, less specific view. So, I'm feeling a little discomfort in my shoulder. And then I recognize there may have been some things that I have done. What actions have I done that maybe created that discomfort? Oh, I know, remember now. It was an action that if you do it without exercising and stretching, it's going to cause some inflammation on your shoulder. And so all exercises like that or all actions without stretching have the potential of causing that kind of rotator cuff pain. Okay, well, now I need to be careful as I think about my next moves to see, since I remember having hurt my shoulder a long time ago, throwing a softball like I was only 12 years old, and not being 12 years old, not having worked out, I hurt my back, my shoulder. Well, now I'm encountering another example of throwing something, and that would be that snowball out in the backyard. And I want to see how far I can throw it. Well, have I stretched yet? I don't know. I better consider that so that I can make a decision in this specific and particular situation based upon lessons I've learned in the past. And I climbed up the stairs and then back down the stairs in order to make a decision. And in order for that to happen, it takes a worldview. In this particular circumstance, the worldview basically affirms that if I do the same thing that I did before, I'll probably have the same consequences that I had before. And that's part of my worldview. Like causes produce like effects. Not everybody agrees, but that's their worldview. Task number 1. What is your worldview? And your task is to put these down in words, your answers to the following questions. And I've already mentioned, and I'm going to spread them out a little bit now. What is prime reality? What is really real? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is a human being? How do you explain human nature? What happens to a person at death? How do you determine what is right and what is wrong? Why is it possible to know anything at all? And what is the meaning of history? Let's start with the first one. What's the bedrock of all that is? The world you think of as real, on what does its reality depend? Another way of thinking about prime reality is how do you know that what you just took place last night was a dream? How do you distinguish a disturbing dream from what's really real? Different ways of working with this particular question help us to recognize that we do have beliefs about what's really real. And it'll be interesting to discover that not everybody agrees, and they have their reasons as well. And those are important for us to look at. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, this is a classic philosophical question. There is something rather than nothing. Here we are. I'm looking at my hands. They are real. Why are they there? Well, I can go back and back and back and keep going back to try to discover why the first something came into existence and try to understand what that is and what's its purpose. It's basically a quest for an ultimate cause. The very real possibility of non-existence, people usually don't even consider that. We take it for granted that the universe exists without ever asking why it exists. Well, the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, may get you thinking about ultimate causes or an ultimate cause. What's a human being? There are many kinds of beings. I just picked up a cup that has a particular nature to it. Its purpose is to hold coffee, and unfortunately, it's empty. Later on, I'll have to fill that up. Anything that exists is a being. What kind of a being is a human being? What is human nature? And what aspects of existence do humans have in common that other beings may not have in common? What are the attributes or the traits or the characteristics that we share with one another that make it possible to distinguish humans as a category of being different from all other categories of being? Do human beings engage in a broad variety of activities not found in other species? These are all ways to unpack the question, what is a human being? Things that you might consider as you seek to answer the main question. What happens to a person at death? When you breathe your last breath, what becomes of you? What, if anything, awaits a person who has just died? Is there anything after physical existence is over? And what do you believe the afterlife will be like? You don't have to answer all these questions as you encounter the what happens to a person at death question, but you do have to take a stab at some aspect of trying to explain what you think will happen after that fatal event. How do you determine what's right and wrong? When you make important decisions that you have a lot of commitment to, what made you know that was the right thing? When you've done something that you regret, why did you regret it? What is it that caused that remorse? Why is it difficult at times to get to sleep after maybe an argument? What is it that makes us feel fulfilled inside when we've done an act that has really benefited someone? Why does that make a difference? How does that become a right thing to do? Well, when you know what you've done, what has led you to that conclusion? Our sixth question is, why is it possible to know anything at all? Notice I'm not asking for a theory of learning here. I'm asking, why can people know things? We have this insatiable, we gotta know, curiosity. And where does that come from? Why do children, they don't have to be taught to ask why, do they? They just automatically do. You did, I still do. My child did, my grandson does. His kids are going to ask why if he has kids. Where do those come from? What's the purpose? And why don't we stop? Why don't we ever stop asking why? Is there a purpose behind our built-in capacity for knowing? Another way to look at why this question is important. And finally, what's the meaning of history? Well, we do believe that it's important to look at past events and why. Is there some event to which things are moving, a climax, or will everything that happens just keep on happening? Why does it matter to care about genealogy or history events or prior civilizations? Or what is it that makes us think that, if we do what history showed had certain consequences, it will probably happen again? And if we do believe that, why do we believe that?